The fire starts sometime after midnight. March 13, 1895. The building is 3335 South Fifth Avenue, Manhattan, a narrow, unremarkable structure in a city that does not yet know what is inside it. By the time the first engine company arrives, the fourth floor is already gone. The flames are not behaving the way building fires typically behave. They are unusually intense, unusually fast, feeding on something that burns hotter than wood and paper. The firefighters note this. The newspapers will note this. Nobody will follow up on it. Inside that building, or rather, inside what used to be that building, is the collected work of the most productive electrical engineer on Earth. Not plans, not sketches, working prototypes. Functional devices that existed nowhere else because the mind that designed them had not yet shared them with anyone. Oscillators, resonance machines, phosphorescent lighting systems years ahead of anything commercially available. Equipment for experiments in wireless transmission that Tesla had been conducting in private, without publication, without peer review, without anyone outside that laboratory understanding what stage they had reached. All of it is burning. The story you know about Tesla, alternating current, Edison, the sad hotel room, that story was built on top of this fire. Everything that comes after this night is shaped by the fact that whatever Tesla had built up to this point no longer existed in physical form. The prototypes were gone. The notes were gone. Years of unpublished experimental data, measurements, observations, calibrations from trials that no one else had witnessed, turned to ash on a single night in March. Tesla is not in the building when it happens. He arrives afterward. A reporter from the New York Sun finds him standing outside, watching. Tesla tells him he is too sick to talk. Another account has him saying that he feels like a man whose heart has been torn out. He is 40 years old. He has spent the last several years working at a pace that would destroy most people, sleeping 2 hours a night, eating almost nothing, running experiments that required him to expose his own body to electrical currents that no safety protocol would permit. And now, the room where all of that work lived is a charred cavity 4 stories above a Manhattan street. The newspapers covered the fire as a personal tragedy for a brilliant inventor. Not one of them cataloged what was inside. No reporter asked for a detailed inventory of the destroyed equipment. No editor assigned a follow-up examining which specific experiments were lost and what they were intended to demonstrate. The Tesla the public knew was the man who won the current wars, but the Tesla who was working on the 4th floor of South Fifth Avenue had moved past alternating current the way a mathematician moves past arithmetic. He was not refining what he had already built. He was building something else. And what that something else was, its scope, its implications, its threat to the infrastructure that was being bolted into place across America on the back of his earlier work, is exactly what disappeared that night. The cause of the fire was never determined with certainty. The investigation did not ask what a deliberately set fire in that building would have accomplished. It did not ask who would have benefited from the destruction of research that, if completed, would have rendered the emerging electrical utility model, the model that required copper wire to every building, meters on every wall, bills to every customer, unnecessary. These questions were not asked in 1895. They are worth asking now, because here is what is documented. Tesla, in the months before the fire, had been privately describing experiments in wireless energy transmission. Not wireless communication, wireless power. The ability to send usable electrical current through the Earth itself, without cables, without infrastructure, without any mechanism that could be metered or sold per unit. He had described this to colleagues. He had described it in letters. He had not yet published it, Because the experimental verification was still underway. Still underway in the laboratory that no longer existed after March 13th. What you were told is that Tesla lost his lab in a fire and rebuilt. What you are not told is what that fire actually destroyed. Not just equipment, but the physical evidence of how far he had already gotten. He rebuilt. Within a few years, he would begin the Colorado Springs experiments, and after that, Wardenclyffe. But he rebuilt from zero, and the only record of how close he had been was Tesla's own memory. A man's entire body of unreleased work, destroyed in a single night, in a city controlled by men who had every reason to want that work to not exist. The official story calls it a tragedy. There is another word for it. By 1895, Nikola Tesla held patents that were running cities. This is not a figure of speech. The alternating current system he designed, the motors, the generators, the transformers, the polyphase power distribution architecture, was the system Westinghouse used to win the contract for the Niagara Falls power plant in 1893. That plant sent electricity to Buffalo, 26 miles away, with an efficiency and reliability that direct current could not touch. Edison's system required a power station every mile. Tesla's could cross a continent. The entire electrical grid you use today, the one powering the screen you are watching this on, is built on Tesla's alternating current architecture. Not derived from it, built on it. The fundamental design has not changed. He demonstrated the Tesla coil in 1891. It produced high-voltage, high-frequency alternating current that could light phosphorescent bulbs without wires. He held the bulbs in his hands during public lectures. The current passed through his body. The audience watched a man hold glass tubes that glowed in his fingers as if they were lit from the inside. He was not performing magic. He was demonstrating resonant energy transfer, a principle that most electrical engineers at the time could not explain, and that the physics community would not fully formalize for decades. He filed the patent for radio in 1897. Marconi, who would later receive credit for the invention, used Tesla's oscillator circuits in his own apparatus, a fact the U.S. Supreme Court acknowledged in 1943 when it posthumously restored Tesla's radio patent. By then, it did not matter. The credit had been assigned. The textbooks had been written. Tesla's name appeared in them as a footnote, when it appeared at all. He built a remote-controlled boat in 1898 and demonstrated it at Madison Square Garden. The audience did not understand what they were seeing. Some thought it was a trick. Some thought a small person was hidden inside. What Tesla had actually built was the first device in history operated by radio frequency remote control, the ancestor of every drone, every guided missile, every remotely operated machine that exists today. He patented it. He offered it to the U.S. military. They were not interested. The concept was too far from anything they could integrate into existing doctrine. Tesla did not produce ideas. He produced working systems that were so far ahead of the institutional capacity to absorb them that they were either ignored, attributed to others, or quietly set aside until the world caught up, by which point Tesla's name had been detached from the work. And he was not slowing down. By the mid-1890s, in the years immediately before the fire, Tesla's private notebooks show a mind that was no longer interested in improving the electrical grid. He was interested in something that made the grid irrelevant. He had begun describing a system in which electrical energy could be transmitted through the Earth itself, using the planet's natural conductivity and resonant frequency to send power to any point on its surface without wires, without relay stations, without any physical infrastructure between the source and the receiver. He was not speculating. He was designing. The notebooks contain calculations, circuit diagrams, and references to preliminary experiments that suggest he had already begun testing components of this system in his laboratory. This is the work that was inside 3335 South Fifth Avenue on the night of March 13, 1895. Tesla had already built systems that worked. Alternating current was not a theory. The Tesla coil was not a theory. Remote control was not a theory. These were engineered, demonstrated, functioning technologies that reshaped industries. And the thing Tesla was building next would not have reshaped an industry. It would have eliminated one. The entire economic model of electrical power, generation, transmission, metering, billing, depends on the physical infrastructure that carries the current from the plant to the customer. Remove that infrastructure, and you do not disrupt the business. You remove the reason the business exists. After the fire, Tesla rebuilt. He secured new funding, found new space, and within a few years would begin the Colorado Springs experiments. But without knowing what he had already built and already proven, the rest of his story looks like the decline of an eccentric dreamer. It was not. It was the unraveling of a man who had demonstrated, repeatedly, that he could build what he said he could build. He was right about the technology. He was wrong about what that would protect him from. In 1901, Tesla walks into a meeting with the most powerful banker in America and asks for money to change the world. He does not phrase it that way. He is more careful than that. What Tesla tells J.P. Morgan is this: he wants to build a global wireless communication system, a tower on Long Island that can transmit messages across the Atlantic, faster, cheaper, and more reliably than anything Marconi is attempting. Morgan understands communication. Communication is a business. It has customers. It has margins. He agrees to invest $150,000, roughly $5 million in today's terms, and in return takes a 51% stake in Tesla's wireless patents. Construction begins in Shoreham, New York. The site is called Wardenclyffe. The architect is Stanford White, one of the most prominent designers in America. The tower rises 187 feet, topped with a 55-ton copper dome. Below it, Tesla orders something that no one fully understands at the time. A shaft sunk 120 feet into the earth, with iron pipes driven even deeper, connecting the tower to the ground in a way that has nothing to do with structural support. This is where the story Morgan agreed to fund and the project Tesla was actually building begin to separate. Tesla's letters to Morgan, letters that survive in the Library of Congress, show the shift in real time. The early letters talk about communication. They talk about signals, bandwidth, competitive advantage over Marconi. But as construction progresses, the language changes. Tesla begins describing the transmission of power, not messages. Power, usable electrical energy, sent through the Earth's crust and the upper atmosphere, receivable at any point on the planet with a simple device tuned to the correct resonant frequency. The technical basis was not fantasy. Tesla had spent 8 months in Colorado Springs in 1899 and 1900 running experiments that confirmed, to his satisfaction, and partially to the documented record, that the Earth itself could function as a conductor. He had produced artificial lightning bolts over 130 feet long, measured the resonant frequency of the Earth, and transmitted enough power wirelessly to light banks of bulbs over a distance of miles. The Colorado Springs notebooks survive. They contain the calculations for a system of global energy distribution using the Earth and the ionosphere as a paired conductor and return path. Wardenclyffe was not a communication tower. It was the first full-scale prototype of that system. The 120-foot shaft was designed to couple the transmitter directly to the Earth's conductive layer. The copper dome was designed to interact with the ionosphere. The tower itself was the antenna, not for radio waves, but for resonant electrical energy that would propagate through the planet, the way sound propagates through a bell when you strike it at the right frequency. If it had worked, and Tesla's prior engineering record gave no one any reason to assume it would not, the implications were not technological. They were structural. Every power line, every transformer station, every meter on every wall, every monthly bill, every coal shipment, and every oil contract that fed the generators. All of it, the entire physical and economic architecture of electrical power distribution, would have become unnecessary. Not obsolete in the way that one technology makes another outdated. Unnecessary in the way that a road becomes unnecessary when you can fly. There is no point in the system where a company can stand and say, "The energy passes through here, and here is where we charge for it." The architecture Tesla was building had no middle. It was point to everywhere. Free because there was nowhere left to install a meter. Morgan began to understand this, not because Tesla told him directly. Tesla was careful in his letters, always framing the project in terms Morgan could accept. But Morgan was not a man who missed implications. He had built his fortune on infrastructure: railroads, steel, copper, electrical utilities. General Electric, which Morgan controlled, was in the business of selling the equipment that carried power from the plant to the customer. Every wire, every transformer, every relay station was a piece of Morgan's economic architecture. Wardenclyffe was not a competitor to that architecture. It was its negation. The letters from Tesla to Morgan grow more urgent through 1902 and into 1903. Tesla asks for more funding. He describes breakthroughs. He promises results. Morgan does not respond. The silence is not confusion. It is a decision. The question is not whether the technology would have worked. It is what it means that the only man in America with the resources to fund it was also the man with the most to lose if it succeeded. Tesla did not walk into Morgan's office with a weapon. He walked in with a design that had no place for Morgan's empire to attach itself. The funding never came. The tower stood half-finished on Long Island, its shaft reaching into the earth, its dome waiting for a current that would never arrive. In December 1901, Marconi sends a signal across the Atlantic. The equipment is simpler than Tesla's. It is already working. Morgan, a pragmatist, looks at the two investments and chooses the one that is delivering results. Wardenclyffe is an expensive bet that has not paid off. The funding stops. End of story. That version is not wrong. It is just incomplete in a way that changes everything. Start with what Morgan actually controlled. By 1903, J.P. Morgan was not merely a banker who happened to invest in electrical companies. He was the financial architecture beneath the electrical industry itself. He had organized the merger that created General Electric in 1892. GE manufactured generators, transformers, meters, wiring, the entire physical apparatus required to move electricity from a power plant to a paying customer. Morgan also had significant interests in copper mining, because copper was the material that made the grid possible. Every mile of wire strung across America put money in Morgan's network. The grid was not just a technology, it was a revenue model, and Morgan was positioned at every node. Now place Wardenclyffe inside that picture. You cannot pivot a copper mine into a resonance receiver. You cannot repurpose a transformer factory for a technology that does not use transformers. Morgan's withdrawal of funding is typically framed as a business decision, and it was. But it was not the business decision the official story describes. It was not, "This technology is failing, so I will stop funding it." It was, "This technology, if it succeeds, destroys the value of everything else I own." There is a difference between a failed investment and a dangerous one. Tesla understood this. His letters from 1903 onward show a man who knows exactly what has happened and is trying to find a way around it. He writes to Morgan offering to reduce his ownership stake. He writes to other potential investors. But the other potential investors check with Morgan first, because that is how finance worked in 1903, and that is how it works now. Morgan does not need to blacklist Tesla publicly. He only needs to not return the calls. In a financial ecosystem where one man's silence functions as a veto, silence is enough. Wardenclyffe construction slows to a halt. Tesla cannot pay the workers. He cannot buy materials. The tower stands on Long Island, structurally complete on the outside, unfinished on the inside. Morgan did not merely stop funding Tesla. The timing of his withdrawal coincided with a broader consolidation of control over the American electrical infrastructure. Between 1900 and 1910, the utility industry in the United States transformed from a patchwork of independent operators into a system of regional monopolies, most of them financed or organized by Morgan's banking network. The model that emerged was centralized generation, long-distance transmission over copper wire, and metered delivery to every home and business. This is the model you still live inside. It was not inevitable. It was chosen. And it was chosen during the exact years that an alternative, Tesla's alternative, was being starved of resources. The word suppression makes people uncomfortable. It implies coordination, conspiracy, a room where powerful men make decisions in secret. That is not what happened here. What happened is simpler and, in some ways, harder to fight. A single man with disproportionate economic power made a rational decision to protect his existing investments by not funding their annihilation. He did not need to conspire. He did not need to issue orders. He simply needed to do nothing. The withdrawal of support in a system where support flows from a small number of sources is indistinguishable from suppression. The effect is identical. The intent does not need to be proven because the mechanism does not require intent. It only requires interest. In 1905, Tesla's mortgage on the Wardenclyffe property went into default. The equipment inside the tower was sold to pay debts. In 1917, the tower itself was demolished, dynamited, and sold for scrap. The structure that was designed to transmit free electrical energy to the entire planet was broken into pieces and sold by weight to recover a fraction of what it had cost to build. The scrap metal had more value in the economy Morgan had built than the tower ever could. Before Wardenclyffe, before Morgan, before any of it went wrong, there was Colorado Springs. In May 1899, Tesla arrives in a small city at the foot of the Rocky Mountains with a single assistant, a letter of introduction from a friend who works for the local power company, and essentially unlimited funding from John Jacob Astor. He has no oversight, no university affiliation, no committee reviewing his methods. He has a building, a barn-like structure on the eastern edge of town with a retractable roof and a 142-foot metal mast rising from its center. And he has 8 months. What he does with those 8 months produces a body of experimental data that physics has never fully reckoned with. The Colorado Springs notes survive. They were published in 1978, a dense technical diary running over 400 pages, written in Tesla's hand, documenting day-by-day experiments conducted between June 1899 and January 1900. They are not speculative. They are empirical. Measurements, circuit configurations, observations recorded with the precision of a man who understood that no one else was watching and that the record would need to speak for itself. The experiments began with resonance. Tesla was testing a hypothesis that the Earth itself had a resonant frequency, a natural electrical pulse that, if matched, could be used to transmit energy through the ground the way a vibration travels through a tuning fork. He built what he called a magnifying transmitter, a device designed to amplify electrical oscillations and inject them into the Earth at precisely the right frequency. The device worked. On the night of one of his most famous experiments, the transmitter produced artificial lightning bolts that crackled over 130 feet from the top of the mast. The thunder was heard in the town of Cripple Creek, 15 miles away. The Colorado Springs power station blew out its generator from the feedback. But the lightning was a side effect. It was not the point. The point was what happened at the receiving end. Tesla set up detection equipment at various distances from the transmitter and measured the signals that arrived through the ground. What he recorded was that electrical energy injected at the correct resonant frequency did not dissipate the way conventional theory predicted. It propagated. It could be detected at distance with a strength that suggested the Earth was not merely conducting the energy, but amplifying it, acting as a resonant cavity that reinforced the signal rather than degrading it. If this measurement was accurate, and Tesla's notes contain the data, the calculations, and the repeated observations that he believed confirmed it, then he had discovered something with implications that went far beyond wireless communication. He had found evidence that the planet itself could function as a medium for energy transfer with minimal loss. Not theoretically, experimentally. In a barn in Colorado with no one watching. The notes also contained something else. On the night of July 3, 1899, Tesla recorded receiving a series of regular electrical signals that he could not attribute to any known terrestrial source. The signals were periodic. They had a structure that suggested to Tesla intentional transmission rather than natural discharge. He wrote about this later in public, carefully but explicitly. He believed he had received signals from outside the Earth. He did not claim to know their origin. He reported what his instruments recorded and noted that the regularity of the pattern was difficult to explain through any known atmospheric phenomenon. The scientific establishment dismissed this. They have continued to dismiss it. The most common explanation offered is that Tesla was detecting signals from one of the other experimenters working with radio equipment in that period, or that he was misinterpreting natural Schumann resonances. These are reasonable objections, but they are objections to Tesla's interpretation, not to his data. The signals were recorded. The instruments were calibrated. What the signals were remains open. That Tesla detected something his instruments could not account for is not. None of it was followed up on. Not by the universities, not by the military, which would later spend billions developing wireless communication systems based on principles far less efficient than what Tesla had already demonstrated. The Colorado Springs experiments do not appear in physics curricula. They do not appear in engineering programs. The data sits in a published book that most electrical engineering students have never heard of. The most productive 8 months of experimental physics in the early 20th century, and the discipline walked past it as if it were not there. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, something detonates above the Siberian taiga near the Podkamenia Tunguska River. The blast flattens approximately 2,000 square kilometers of forest, 80 million trees knocked outward in a radial pattern from a central point. The force is estimated at 10 to 15 megatons. That is 1,000 times the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Windows shatter hundreds of miles away. The pressure wave registers on barographs in England. The night sky over Europe glows for days, bright enough to read a newspaper at midnight in London. There is no crater. There is no meteorite. No fragment of any extraterrestrial object has ever been recovered from the site. The first scientific expedition does not reach the area until 1927, 19 years later. What they find is the radial pattern of destruction, the absence of a crater, and a question that has not been settled since. The leading hypothesis today is an airburst, a stony asteroid or comet fragment that exploded several miles above the surface. It is a reasonable hypothesis. It accounts for the blast pattern and the absence of a crater. It does not account for the luminous skies over Europe, which some researchers have argued are inconsistent with a simple airburst event. It does not fully account for the geomagnetic disturbances recorded at the time. And it does not explain why, despite over a century of searching, no confirmed fragment of the object has been found. This is the official file on Tunguska. It is thick with data and thin on consensus. Now, open a different file. In the years between Colorado Springs and Wardenclyffe, Tesla had been writing and speaking about something he called a directed energy weapon. Not in those words, the phrase would not exist for decades, but the concept was explicit. In interviews and in letters, Tesla described the possibility of using his magnifying transmitter technology to send focused bursts of electrical energy to specific points on the Earth's surface. He described it as a defensive weapon, a system that could destroy incoming warships or aircraft at a distance by directing concentrated energy through the Earth and atmosphere to a target. He also made a statement that has followed him through every biography written since. He said he could split the Earth like an apple if he found the right resonant frequency. He said it in public. He said it more than once. Tesla's Colorado Springs experiments had demonstrated, to his own documented satisfaction, that the Earth could function as a resonant conductor. Wardenclyffe was designed to be the first full-power implementation of that principle. In 1908, Wardenclyffe was still standing. It was not operational at the scale Tesla had intended, but the infrastructure was in place. The tower was there. The shaft into the Earth was there. The magnifying transmitter, or some version of it, was on site. The Tunguska event occurred on June 30th, 1908. This video is not going to tell you that Tesla caused the Tunguska explosion. That claim cannot be supported by the available evidence. What this video is going to do is place two things next to each other and let you sit with what that proximity feels like. Tesla had described, in writing and in public statements, the ability to direct focused energy to any point on the planet's surface using the Earth's resonant frequency. He had built equipment designed to do this. He had tested components of that equipment in Colorado Springs. And in 1908, an explosion of enormous force occurred at a remote point on the Earth's surface, leaving no crater, no fragments, and no conclusive explanation after more than a century of investigation. No one has established a causal connection. No one has seriously attempted to investigate whether one exists. Two open files. Nobody has put them in the same room. The taiga has regrown. The trees that were flattened in 1908 have been replaced by a century of new growth. The site looks, from satellite imagery, like any other stretch of Siberian forest, except for a faint circular pattern in the vegetation that is still visible from altitude. A scar that is not fully healed in over 100 years. Whatever made that mark, the Earth has not forgotten it. And the tower on Long Island, the one that may or may not have had anything to do with it, was demolished 9 years later. Not investigated, not preserved, demolished. You are now past the halfway point of a story that took months to research and verify. Every claim in this video is sourced. Every document referenced is real. A question, a suspicion, a sudden need to go verify it yourself. Leave that thought in the comments. We read every one, not as metrics, as letters from people who are paying attention. And if you want to be here when the next file gets opened, subscribe. It means everything to channels like this. The story is not over. There are 4 more sections, and they cover what happened after Tesla died, which, in some ways, is stranger than anything that happened while he was alive. Nikola Tesla dies alone in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel on January 7, 1943. He is 86 years old. He has been living in the hotel for a decade, moving between rooms as his debts accumulated, feeding pigeons in Bryant Park, giving occasional interviews in which he described weapons and energy systems that journalists treated as the ramblings of a fading mind. He has no family in the country. He has no laboratory. He has not built anything in years. By every visible measure, he is a spent force, an old man in a small room with a box of papers and a lifetime of unpublished work. He is found by a maid on the morning of January 8. The "Do Not Disturb" sign had been on the door for 2 days. Within hours, not days, not after the funeral, not after the estate is settled, agents from the Office of Alien Property arrive at the hotel and seize everything. Every notebook, every document, every piece of paper in the room. The agency's jurisdiction is wartime seizure of property belonging to foreign nationals. Tesla had been a naturalized U.S. citizen since 1891. He had been an American citizen for 52 years. The legal basis for the seizure was, at best, strained, but it happened within hours of the body being discovered. The speed of that response raises a question that the official record does not answer. The papers were transported to the Manhattan Storage and Warehouse Company under Office of Alien Property seal. The official record shows what happened next. The military wanted the papers reviewed. Specifically, they wanted to know whether Tesla's work contained anything of military significance, anything related to weapons, energy systems, or communication technology that could be relevant to the war effort. The man selected to conduct this review was John G. Trump, professor of electrical engineering at MIT, member of the National Defense Research Committee, and, as a matter of biographical fact that has been noted many times since, the uncle of Donald Trump. John Trump spent approximately 3 days reviewing Tesla's papers. His official report concluded that the papers contained nothing which would constitute a hazard in unfriendly hands. He described the work as primarily speculative and philosophical in nature, lacking practical application. The military accepted this assessment. The case officially was closed. 3 days to review the lifetime output of one of the most prolific inventors in modern history, a man who held over 300 patents, a man who had spent decades developing wireless energy transmission, directed energy weapons, and resonant frequency systems, a man whose Colorado Springs notebooks alone run over 400 pages of dense technical documentation. 3 days. Either John Trump was the fastest reader in the history of technical review, or he was not asked to conduct a thorough evaluation. He was asked to produce a conclusion. And he produced the right one. The papers were eventually transferred to the Tesla Museum in Belgrade in 1952. Most of them. The inventory lists that accompanied the transfer do not match the inventory lists created at the time of seizure. Items are missing. Not misplaced. Missing. Specific notebooks referenced in Tesla's own correspondence, notebooks he described as containing his most advanced work on particle beam weapons and wireless energy transmission, do not appear in the Belgrade collection. They do not appear in any known collection. Their location has never been accounted for. The FBI maintained a file on Tesla. This is not disputed. The file was released under the Freedom of Information Act. It runs several hundred pages. Much of it is redacted. The redactions are not unusual in themselves. FBI files from this era are routinely redacted. What is unusual is that an FBI file on Tesla exists at all with that level of redaction. If his work was, as John Trump concluded, speculative and without practical value, then there is nothing in it that would require classification. Speculative philosophy does not get redacted. Material of military or strategic significance does. The file itself contradicts the conclusion that was used to close it. You do not need a conspiracy theory to connect these points. You need arithmetic. What was in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel on the night Tesla died is a question that has never been fully answered. What left that room in government hands has never been fully disclosed. Tesla died with a "Do Not Disturb" sign on his door. The sign was ignored within hours. Everything else he left behind has been disturbed ever since. Tesla filed over 300 patents in his lifetime. You have heard of maybe 5. The alternating current motor, the Tesla coil, the radio patent that was stolen and eventually returned, the remote control, perhaps the rotating magnetic field. These are the patents that made it into the textbooks, the ones that could be absorbed into the existing industrial framework because they improved it rather than threatened it. The rest of the patents, the majority of them, describe systems that have never been commercially developed. Not because they were theoretical, not because they failed testing, because what they describe, if built, would require dismantling the infrastructure that was constructed in their place. 3 clusters matter most. The first is wireless energy transmission. Tesla did not file a single patent on this subject. He filed a series of interlocking designs that describe, in technical detail, a system for transmitting usable electrical power through the Earth without wires. Patent 1,119,732, filed in 1902 and granted in 1914, describes an apparatus for transmitting electrical energy that uses the Earth as a conductor and the elevated terminal, the Wardenclyffe Dome, as a capacitive interface with the upper atmosphere. The patent does not speculate. It provides circuit diagrams, component specifications, and operating parameters. It is an engineering document, not a thought experiment. It describes a machine. The second cluster is atmospheric electricity harvesting. Tesla held patents on devices designed to capture the electrical energy that exists naturally in the atmosphere, energy produced by the voltage differential between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. Patent 685,957, granted in 1901, describes a method for utilizing radiant energy that collects charge from the ambient electrical field and converts it to usable current. The principle is real. The voltage differential between the ground and the upper atmosphere is measurable and enormous, approximately 400,000 volts across the full height of the atmosphere. Tesla's patent describes a means of tapping into this field using elevated conductors and specialized capacitor circuits. The energy source is permanent. It is global. It requires no fuel. The third cluster is what Tesla called the magnifying transmitter. This is the device he built in Colorado Springs, the one that produced artificial lightning and transmitted power through the ground. The patents related to this device describe a system for amplifying electrical oscillations using resonant coupling with the Earth's natural frequency. The magnifying transmitter was not a larger version of the Tesla coil. It was a different class of device, one that used the Earth itself as part of the circuit, turning the planet into a component rather than an obstacle. This is not a technical problem. It is an economic one. The patents are public, the technical specifications are available. The principles they describe have not been disproven, they have been ignored. A disproven technology is a dead end. An ignored technology is a choice. And the choice, in this case, was made not by physicists, but by the financial structures that determine which technologies receive development funding and which do not. Directed energy weapons, the category Tesla described in the 1930s, are now an active area of military research. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing have all developed or are developing systems that use focused electromagnetic energy as a weapon. Energy directed at a distance, focused on a target without a physical projectile. Tesla described this in the 1930s. Raytheon builds it now. The patents sit in the public record, available to anyone who searches for them. What is absent is follow-up. No institutional effort to take what Tesla documented and test it at scale. Over 300 patents from a man whose built prototypes consistently worked, and the vast majority have never been constructed. The question is not whether the technology is real. Tesla's engineering record answers that. The question is, who decided it would not be developed? And what we are still paying for that decision. Tesla was not the last person to build something that threatened the grid. He was the first to do it publicly, with documentation, with patents, with a reputation that could not be quietly erased. The ones who came after him did not have that protection. Most of them do not have Wikipedia pages. The pattern is not dramatic. That is what makes it difficult to dismiss. It does not involve men in dark suits showing up at laboratories in the middle of the night. It involves something less cinematic and more effective. It involves funding that dries up at a specific moment, patent applications that stall without explanation, licensing agreements that appear generous and then lock the technology into a company that never develops it, peer review processes that take years for work that challenges the existing model and weeks for work that confirms it. A set of institutional mechanisms that do not require coordination because they are built into the structure itself. The same structure that defunded Wardenclyffe. Thomas Henry Murray was a Utah-based engineer who, in the 1920s and 1930s, built a device he called a radiant energy receiver. Witnesses, including skeptics he invited specifically to disprove his claims, reported that the device produced measurable electrical output without any visible input source. Murray described it as harvesting energy from the ambient electromagnetic field, a principle directly in line with Tesla's atmospheric electricity patents. He demonstrated the device multiple times. He invited the press. He invited engineers. He applied for patents. The patent office rejected his applications repeatedly, on grounds that the device described a perpetual motion machine, which it did not since it claimed an external energy source. He was shot at. He spent the rest of his life trying to get his work recognized. He failed. John Bedini was an audio engineer who, beginning in the 1980s, built a series of devices based on what he described as Tesla's radiant energy principles. His motors used pulsed electromagnetic fields to charge batteries in ways that conventional electrical theory said should not work. He demonstrated them publicly. He published his circuit designs. Other experimenters replicated versions of his work with varying degrees of success. Bedini was never funded by any major institution. He operated out of a small workshop for decades, producing devices that the mainstream engineering community either ignored or dismissed without replication. Stanley Meyer, an Ohio inventor, built what he called a water fuel cell in the 1990s. He claimed the device could split water into hydrogen and oxygen using far less energy than conventional electrolysis, making water a viable fuel source. He was awarded patents. He demonstrated the device to investors and journalists. In 1996, an Ohio court found against him in a civil lawsuit, ruling that the device constituted fraud. Meyer maintained that it worked. He died suddenly in 1998 during a meeting at a restaurant. He was 57. His equipment and papers were reported missing shortly after his death. None of these cases, taken individually, proves suppression. Murray's device was never independently verified under controlled laboratory conditions. Bedini's work was never subjected to rigorous peer review. Meyer's claims were contested in court. Each case has an explanation that fits within the boundaries of ordinary failure. An inventor who overpromised, a technology that did not hold up, a man with health problems who died at a statistically unremarkable age. But the cases do not exist individually. They exist as a pattern. And the pattern has a feature that is consistent across decades. An inventor working in Tesla's direct lineage produces a device that threatens the centralized energy model. The device is demonstrated, but never reaches institutional-level testing. The inventor is discredited, defunded, or dies. The technology disappears, and the next inventor starts from scratch, because the previous work was never preserved in any institutional record. The structure does what the structure was built to do. Tesla was stopped by Morgan. Murray was stopped by the patent office and a bullet. Meyer was stopped by a lawsuit and a death. Bedini was stopped by silence. The method changes. The outcome does not. The tower came down in 1917, not in a fire, not in a storm. It was demolished on purpose, dynamited by a salvage company to recover the materials and pay Tesla's debts. The structure that was designed to give free electrical energy to every human being on the planet was knocked down, broken into pieces, and sold by weight. The copper, the steel, the bolts, priced per pound and carted away by men who had no idea what they were dismantling. Tesla was not there. He had lost control of the property years earlier. The mortgage had defaulted in 1905. The equipment inside had already been sold. By the time the explosives were set, Wardenclyffe was not a laboratory. It was a liability on a balance sheet, and the most efficient way to resolve it was to turn it into scrap. The land sat empty for decades. The foundation of the tower remained, a concrete slab and the shaft that Tesla had sunk 120 feet into the earth. The shaft that was supposed to couple his transmitter to the planet's conductive layer. The shaft was eventually filled in. The slab cracked and settled into the ground. Weeds grew over it. The site became, for most of the 20th century, exactly what it looked like: an empty lot on Long Island with no marker and no sign explaining what had once stood there. In 2013, a crowdfunding campaign raised enough money to purchase the property. In 2018, the Wardenclyffe site was designated a museum, the Tesla Science Center at Wardenclyffe. There is a building there now. There are exhibits. There is a gift shop. The foundation of the tower is preserved. You can visit it. You can stand where the tower stood and look at the concrete and try to imagine what it was supposed to do. But the tower is not there. The transmitter is not there. The thing that mattered, the device, the system, the machine that Tesla spent the last productive years of his life trying to complete, is gone. What remains is a monument to the fact that it was attempted. A museum built on the site of a demolition. The story you are told about Tesla ends with a word like tragic or visionary. A brilliant man, too far ahead of the institutions that could have supported him. In that version, nobody is responsible. The failure is structural. The loss is regrettable. But you have now seen what that framing leaves out. The funding that was removed. The patents that were never developed. The papers that were seized and never fully returned. The silence that followed every attempt to continue the work. These are not the features of a technology that failed. They are the features of a technology that was not allowed to be tested. The foundation is still in the ground on Long Island. The shaft has been filled in, but the concrete remains. If you stand on it, you are standing on the exact point where Tesla intended to connect his transmitter to the Earth. The point where, if his calculations were correct, the planet itself would have become part of the circuit. The tower is gone. The man is gone. The question is not.